was the late summer of 1993. I had just graduated from seminary. I was a brand new ordained pastor. By the way, I am again, just in case you were looking to get married, I'm legally authorized to do that in the state of Washington. No, dumb. Anyway, the late summer of 1993, my good friend Mike Michaels was visiting the house where I lived at the time, and he introduced me to something that I'd heard of, that I knew about, that I understood at least as well as I could have at that point, but I had never actually experienced. The internet. Dun, dun, dun. Of course, in those days, the internet was, well, it was AOL. And I don't think anybody thought that was really weird. I mean, I knew there was more to it than that, but AOL was the easiest, cheapest, quickest way to get on. You just signed up for an account. You paid your $14.95 a month plus downloading charges for artwork, and you listened to the sound of the 14K modem, later upgraded to a 56K modem connecting, and you knew you were just seconds away, or minutes away, from interfacing with the rest of the world, the rest of America, online. It was exciting. I mean, it really was. It was unique. I mean, it was different. It all of a sudden, you could talk to people all over the country, and indeed the world, to a lesser degree at that point. But things that we take for granted today about the internet weren't so clear in those days. One of the things that I learned very quickly about the internet was there are places to chat about all kinds of things. Of course, being a recent seminary graduate, I wanted to talk theology. And so I found my way to some theology chat rooms on AOL, chat boards, whatever you want to call them, and I began to interact with folks there. And what I quickly learned is that it doesn't matter what your opinion is. There are at least a dozen people who are ready to tell you that you're wrong. And it doesn't matter why you believe it. It quickly degenerated into arguments. That's all it really was. There was very little, does this sound familiar today? There's very little actual communication or transfer of knowledge or discussion or anything like that. It was all arguments. Big shocker, huh? Well, in one of those boards that I was particularly active on, and I've long since forgotten the name of it, I met. See, that's how the language has changed. People that we've met online now become people that we've met. People who are friends that I've never actually seen in my life are now friends. The internet has changed the way that we see things like that. But in the AOL days, I met a guy online, and he was it's a pretty interesting character. His name was Norm. He said that he was a veteran, United States Air Force. He said, and I distinctly remember this, that he had been an officer in the United States Air Force, and for whatever reason, I still believe that he told me that he had been a major in the United States Air Force. Now, I can't quote that. I can't tell you the day that I can't show you none of that. But for years, I thought he had been a major in the United States Air Force. Turned out he wasn't, but really, who's surprised by that? He also said that he was an ordained pastor of the Baptist faith, and Norm was a character. Norm was entertaining. He was agitating. He was annoying and irritating. He was the most dogmatic, ideologue person I have, at that point in my life, ever met. He didn't just disagree with you on theological points. He made it clear that you were so wrong that God wasn't even going to bother burning you in hell. He was just going to whisk you into wherever because you were that wrong. And he was that right. And Norm was, look, I know a little bit about theology. I know the differences between Baptist beliefs and Methodist beliefs and, Arminian theology and Calvinistic theology and that sort of thing. So some of that I expected. But there came the day when this very passionate, and by passionate I mean ideologue, man named Norm began to drift into other areas about how the government must be run by Christians. And by Christians, he meant Baptists, and by Baptists, he meant him. That any government that didn't agree with him was ungodly and needed to be destroyed. That was the implication that he made very clear, that any government that opposed what he believed religiously, any person who didn't agree with him, was unfit for office. It was then that I discovered that Norm Olson, who would claim to some fame in that era as the commander of the Michigan militia, that's when I found out who he really was. Norm was, in my recollection of things, very, very ideological, very demanding, very insistent. I don't even know why he was on these boards. I really don't, other than maybe he just had way too much free time and he liked arguing with people. Apparently so did I. If I were to meet someone like Norm today, I would block them and walk away. But in those days, those options didn't exist. If you were on the board, you saw what he said and you heard what he said and heard in your mind. And you tried to pretend that you had this vision of him as he really was and all of that kind of stuff, but you didn't really know. I mean, it wasn't until, that was in 93, it wasn't until 1995 that I knew what Norm looked like. And why did I know what Norm looked like? Because in June of 1995, Norm Olson appeared on C-SPAN in front of a congressional senatorial committee meeting talking about domestic terrorism. In April of that year, the Oklahoma City bombing had occurred, and Senator Arlen Specter wanted to talk to some of these militia people in front of Congress because he believed that somehow or another he was going to learn something about these people. Well, he did. Probably wasn't what he expected to learn. The video is still available. It's 2.5 hours long if you really want to watch it. I don't, again. But Norm was there. And it was here that Norm informed the entire world, the Congress of the United States, the Senate of the United States, the entire world, that it wasn't Timothy McVeigh and the other guy whose name escapes me at the moment, who were associated with the Michigan militia. They were not members of the Michigan militia, of which Norm had been the commander of, but had recently been voted out. But they were friends with. They knew them. They hang out in the same places and the same people and that sort of thing. It was there that Norm Olson, the now former commander of the Michigan militia, informed everybody that it hadn't been Timothy McVeigh and, I can't remember the other guy's name. Anyway, they weren't the guys that bombed Oklahoma City. It was, in fact, the Japanese. I'm not kidding. He believed this. It's probably why he lost his position as the commander of the Michigan militia. But he informed the world that the Japanese had bombed Oklahoma City as retaliation for us, quote, gassing their subways, unquote. Norm is a certifiable whack job, folks. He is deep into what I would now recognize. I didn't recognize it then. It was 1993. Nobody knew any of this stuff. Now I would recognize him as a conspiracy theorist, as an attention whore, as someone who, if you're not listening to him, he can't deal with that. He cannot, accept the idea that people can legitimately disagree with him, or that the thought that he might be wrong about something has never entered his mind, ever. He ended up leaving Michigan after he got de-elected as commander of the Michigan militia, and made his way to Alaska, where the last time I heard of him, in 2009, he was attempting to recruit new militia members for a new Alaska militia, which presumably he would command and then, eventually get voted out of, because people would find out that he was, basically insane. And that would be, his modus operandi. It was a fascinating experience for me, and it was a fascinating time of learning for me. I got to be honest, at that point in my life, I was still more concentrating on the theological arguments, and you will know that there are many theological differences between Baptists and Wesleyan Arminians. And then you throw in the fact that I was with the Salvation Army on top of it, and it was good in some ways because it forced me to think about why I believed what I believed, which, by the way, I do not believe anymore, but that's another story altogether. It's another story. But at the time, I found it very useful because I was a new minister, a new pastor. I was still learning things, and I found it good. As I think it says somewhere in the book of Timothy, one of the Timothys, study, show yourself approved, be prepared to discuss and debate and all that sort of thing. And so I found it useful in that aspect of it. Now I would recognize it for what it was, which was conspiracy theorism 101, and, like I said, attention whoring. That said, it was an experience that never really left my head. In many ways, when I hear militia people today talk, when I hear people who are clearly, vehemently, violently anti-government, I picture Norm. It's not even a struggle for me. That's what I see in my head is Norm Olson, because he embodies so much of what they were and what they are and what they try to be. It is therefore no surprise when we see what happened over the last couple of days up in Michigan, where we learned that a group calling itself the Michigan Wolverines, or the Wolverine Watch, which is, as far as I can tell, I'll tell you, I only did about an hour's worth of research on them. I didn't feel like really going in depth into them. But near as I can tell, they are some sort of offshoot of the Michigan militia, the original Michigan militia, but not necessarily the same thing, which doesn't surprise me. The militia movement is fractured. It is, as we learned with Norm Olson, it is full of, it's a pure democracy. They're like pirates. They operate as a pure democracy, but when someone disagrees within the group, they can very easily be booted out. There are websites that are full of discussions about, well, this person's no longer in charge of this militia, even though it still says that they are on their website. Find them. You can look them up yourself. I'm not going to drag you out. Back in the summer of 2020, this year, when Michigan was shut down, as many places were, these various militia groups rallied at the Capitol, sans mask, as you can see in the pictures in the paper, and they're on the screen if you're watching the video. They open carried because they can. They had American flags. They had signs that said "End the lockdown." And, of course, they had Trump-Pence signs. And now we know that they were, in fact, even at that time, plotting to kidnap, possibly kill Governor Whitmer in Michigan. Now, we know a little bit about what's going on here. We don't know everything, but we know some things that are certain here. Number one, we know that this particular group, which was not actually the Wolverines, it was a separate group that then met the Wolverines and sort of merged-ish, although not officially. We know that they were on Facebook recruiting members. We know that until June, when Facebook did its grand purge of Boogaloo groups, that this group was one of the groups that was purged. We also know that they were using secure texting apps, encrypted texting apps. We do not know what those apps were as of right now. We know that they were using them, and we know that they were communicating in code words and in the process of coming up with their plans. What we don't know is whether or not they were actually, I'm going to use a term that seems odd, but we don't know if they were really serious about this or not. We don't know. We suspect, because the FBI has obviously arrested them, we suspect that they were up to no good, and we suspect that they were actually going to do this, or at least planning to do it, which is still a crime. It's a conspiracy. But we don't know if they would have really gone through with it. I will say something here that might get me in trouble, but it has been my experience with militia groups throughout the years that most of them, big hat, no cattle. They do a lot of talking. They do a lot of complaining, a lot of quasi-threatening, but when push comes to shove, they don't really do much anything. That's been my experience with them. Now, obviously, on occasion, they've been noted to get out of control. Oklahoma City being a good example. Charlottesville being another example. And perhaps we're seeing more and more of this. But as a general rule of thumb, like most cowards, they hide behind words and phrases and secret meetings and handshakes and the likes of that. We don't know how serious they were. But the threat was obviously real enough that the FBI took action and arrested them, and good on the FBI. This has, of course, led to some interesting things being said. For example, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot said that all roads lead back to Donald Trump when it comes to this plan to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She's completely wrong about that. These groups existed long before Donald Trump even thought about running for the presidency of the United States. These groups existed and made these same sorts of plans because I know back in the 90s, I listened to the then commander of the Michigan militia, one Norm Olson, tell me about how all these government agencies should be shut down. All these people should be killed as treasonous traitors. That's kind of redundant, but you get the idea here. They have believed this for years. This is nothing new. There's nothing here that is, surprising news, breaking news. What is different here is that the FBI has taken it seriously enough to take action. This is no longer just a bunch of people in a saloon somewhere in the West, Midwest, upper Midwest somewhere, drinking too much beer and talking too much crap. Now, it seems serious enough that we should take some action. I don't know how far they're going to be able to go with this. I don't know. But there remains the fact that they, in fact, did not kidnap the governor of Michigan. They didn't kill her. They didn't do anything. They didn't actually do anything except talk about doing it. Still a crime. Still people that should be taken out and punished appropriately within the confines of the law, but it still leaves us with the militia problem, because the militias are going to now they're going to martyr these guys. They're going to turn them into literal martyrs for their beliefs and their mission. The problem with this, of course, is the Constitution of the United States is very clear about what constitutes a militia. And one of the things Norm used to say to me all the time was the Constitution. It's God, the Constitution, then my family. Boom. And while I don't disagree with that, at least in principle, I didn't know the Constitution then as I do now. And that's to my own shame, I guess, in many ways. The Constitution is very clear about militias. Congress has the authority to call forth a militia. Congress has that authority, not Norm Olson. Congress has the authority to call them forth to execute laws, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Congress also has the responsibility to provide for organizing, arming, disciplining, and for governing such partisans who may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively, the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. This has led to what I have said for many, many years. In some ways, I wish I could go back to 1993, 1994, having those conversations again with people who are telling me what the Constitution is. This is what conspiracy theorists do. They say things that sound rational. Well, we all believe in limited government. We all believe that the government is founded on Christian beliefs. We all believe this stuff. And to the uneducated, to the people who aren't thinking, it makes sense. And I tell you, it's much like, much like the Apostle Paul. Many years ago, I heard my own father preach a 4-part sermon on Sundays, because I used to have to, my dad was a preacher, for those of you who don't know, Salvation Army officer, and I would have to sit in the chapel and listen to him preach. He preached, as I recall, a 4-part sermon series on why God changed Saul's name to Paul. And he had all kinds of logical reasons for why this would happen. And no doubt much commentary was involved in this and all this kind of things. But you know what the problem with that is? Is that God never changed Saul's name to Paul. Luke did. Oh, you don't believe that? Go find me the part where it says, and God said, from hereforth you shall be called Paul. You're not going to find it. And the same thing happens with the Constitution and these issues. We hear all these things, and we take them as gospel truth until we actually go and look at them and actually go read them. And when we discover that militias are subject to congressional oversight, which, by the way, Congress has now placed in the National Guard, when you find out that the training is supposed to be conducted by the state, not by Norm Olson, you start asking yourself some questions here, don't you? And the reality of it is that unless your officers and training and discipline, as prescribed by Congress, are overseen by your state, in this particular case in Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, it's a pretty simple equation. Unless you meet those criteria that are in the Constitution that you keep telling me that you support and defend, you're not a militia. We're a gang. And that makes you criminals.